Hello! Welcome to this bit of Linux propaganda, where I try to explain the basics of what Linux is and how I suggest that you can get started if you want to start using it as an operating system. I make this video for friends, but in case I get nerd sniped or something, I'm just having fun here. This video is not meant as discourse. Please do not bring me Linux discourse. Also, an important preface, I love Linux and I love talking about it and I love encouraging people to use it. However, if you don't want to, that's fine. You can use computers in whatever way you please. Also, if you want to use Linux differently from the way that I do, that's also fine. Alright, Linux. Linux is an open source kernel, a piece of software that handles communication between your computer's parts and the software that you want to run. It was initially developed by Linus Torvalds in 1991. Technically, Linux is just that kernel. That might be confusing because what we generally call Linux is an operating system that uses the Linux kernel. If anyone reminds you of that in casual conversation, unprompted, you need to ask them to calm the hell down. Generally, Linux-based operating systems are open source and free. What that entails, and why I say generally, we'll return to later. Because its base is open source and free and has been around for decades, there's a lot of versions of it. The specifics of what the differences are between these versions can be a bit computer sciencey, and it can get that computer sciencey really fast, and I want to avoid that in this video. However, I think it's important to have a little bit of context, so let's give it a try. The many versions of Linux are called distributions, or distros for short. If you want to be one of the cool kids, you call it a distro. It implies that you have swag and you know what you're talking about. I personally don't, but it helps me pretend. Distro is nothing else than a collection of software that makes your computer usable. The differences between distros are generally 1. What software is included in your base collection of software. 2. What standards and principles you apply to arrive at that collection. And 3. How you manage and install more software. That's a bit of an oversimplification, but bear with me, we've got to start somewhere. Just now I mentioned ways of managing and installing software. Let's dig into that for a moment. If you're used to Windows, if you want to install something, you're used to getting a setup file that you can run and install, and that will generally just work. With really old software, you might get into trouble with like 32 and 16-bit, and there's buggy software around, but generally, just running the installer is the basic principle. Unfortunately, Linux is less standardized for a multitude of reasons. This means that there's multiple methods of package management, managing what you've got installed on your computer. You can install packages from source code that you get from GitHub and build them yourselves, but that's a bit complicated. Generally, what you want to use is a package manager, and there's a lot of those around, each with their own repositories to download software from. If you're lucky, nowadays you usually are, they also manage dependencies between your software. For day-to-day users, these package managers are one of the key differences between Linux distros. I think it's easiest to explain what distros are and what they entail using an example, and I'll do so using everyone's favorite example distro, Debian. Debian is one of the oldest Linux distros that's still active. It's open source and it's free. Free in the sense that you don't have to pay for it, but also free in the sense that you're free to do with it whatever you please. You can modify it, use it privately or commercially, etc. Most software that comes with Debian falls under this umbrella of free, making it one of the core sensibilities that the distro is built around. Another sensibility is stability and long-term support. It allows you to get more software straight from Debian's repositories with a tool called apt or apt, Advanced Packaging Tool. This is a command line tool, but nowadays Debian also comes with something called a Synaptic Package Manager, which offers access to apt packages through its user interface. I could go on listing more software and listing stuff about how Debian is free and the discourse around that, but I think the point is clear. Debian is an example of a distro, which is in turn a collection of software gathered by a certain set of principles or ideas. Different distros have different sensibilities. I named Debian, but there's more, which you should probably look up on the internet. There's Debian derivatives like Ubuntu and Linux Mint, but also wholly other ones that don't involve Debian at all, each with their own ups and downs and ideas. There's quite often a bunch of culture and context around each of them. For example, a well-known and pretty widely used distro is Fedora. Although this is open source and developed with a lot of community involvement, this is sponsored and partly developed by the American company called Red Hat. Red Hat uses Fedora as a sort of proving ground for their commercial distro Red Hat Enterprise Linux. There's a lot more discourse there. You can talk about CentOS and Alma Linux, etc. As I said, a little bit of context around each distro. Another example that I think is good to mention because it's quite different from the other two so far is Arch Linux. Arch Linux is a distro aimed to keeping itself as simple as possible, leaving a very minimal base install. Also a base install that's pretty difficult to install. It's centered around a rolling release instead of a stable release like Debian. This allows users to get the most recent versions of packages, sometimes at the sacrifice of stability. There's more distros around, and it's worth Googling a bit. Just Google Linux distros comparison, and click on Wikipedia and Arch Linux Wiki and a bunch of other good resources around. Also, I'm generally quite oversimplifying here. This video is meant as an introduction, and not a course. I'm not qualified to make a course about this, no matter how much I might like to. Anyway, let's have a closer look at the software that can be installed in your Linux distro of choice. One of the most important collections of software packages in a distro, for beginner and home users, are related to your OS's graphical user interface. You see, you can just get Linux with a terminal and a shell, and that'll be an operating system. It'll be similar to MS-DOS if you've ever heard of that. However, that takes some time to learn, and it makes it quite difficult to juggle multiple windows, and we've quite gotten used to using a lot of windows on our computers. And it makes us more productive, so we want some help. Generally, this help comes in the form of a desktop environment. Desktop environments are, in short, tremendous sources of discourse, and they make the use of your computer a lot easier. As an example, let's have an ironic look at Microsoft Windows. A lot of people are very familiar with Microsoft Windows. There's a bunch of components in Microsoft Windows that feel like this mystical part of the system that are actually just programs running on your computer. That sounds obvious, but sometimes we forget. For example, the taskbar and the window manager, by which I mean the thing that allows for different windows to live on your screen. Your file manager, file explorer, the start menu, the settings screen, the network management menu, and so on. All these programs together are what we will find distributed for Linux as desktop environments. There's many kinds and flavors of desktop environments. You've got fully featured ones, you've got lightweight ones, you've got very pretty ones, you've got functional oriented ones, and so on. Whichever one you choose, they're often highly customizable. You can make them look like Windows, you can make them look like macOS, you can make them look like your own thing. I'll name a few examples. First off, you've got GNOME, which has a very clean look, and the default look actually sort of resembles macOS, in my opinion. You've got KDE Plasma, which comes with a lot of features and customization and is generally really pretty and easy to use for Windows users. Windows 10 specifically. You've got XFCE, which is what all the cool kids use and is objectively the best, and all the others suck, bite me. No, I'm joking. XFCE is a very lightweight Windows 7-like desktop environment. It's fine. It also has some limitations. Anyway, you've also got Cinnamon, which is basically Windows 7 but a lot faster and for Linux. I could go on, and I make jokes about XFCE, but you can use whatever you like. You can engage in discourse, but in the end, no one cares. You can just choose something and use it if you like it, and choose something else if you don't. Even better, you can use separate parts. As I said, a desktop environment is just a collection of programs, a taskbar, a file manager, a start menu, etc. You can just use only a few of these. You can just install a window manager or a compositor that allows you to use windows that you open but not have a taskbar. You can also be a special little snowflake and use a tiling system like Sway in i3 or Hyperland and be really happy with that because your productivity will go up, but no one will ever be able to use your computer without a guide. Okay, I'm sorry, I digress, but tiling window managers are really cool. And that's that part of the video. Let's move on. So that's a lot of information on what Linux is. Now let's talk about reasons why I think it might be nice to use Linux and why I personally love using it. The first reason is that Linux is free. You can just download it. Windows is pretty expensive, but you don't have to pay for most consumer versions of Linux. They're all open source, and that gives you a lot of freedom. Generally, most distros are also pretty lightweight, allowing you to use it on older hardware, especially with more lightweight desktop environments. It used to be the case that Linux was regarded as a sort of it's free but it sucks situation, but this is no longer really the case. There's generally been an increase of native support for applications, but other than that, I personally used to play a lot of video games, and I still do, to be quite honest, and playing games has gotten a lot easier. Valve, the makers of Steam, and Half-Life, of course, developed their own distro called SteamOS for use on the Steam Deck, and subsequently also pumped a bunch of development money into Wine, a wrapper that allows you to run Windows applications on Linux. With these improvements, performance has increased majorly. Sure, you can't run everything out of the box. Games with kernel level anti-cheat, not naming and shaming here, those might be difficult. And unfortunately, there's just some software that won't run. However, for most private use cases of your computer or desktop, it's more than enough. I personally even do modding for games on Linux. For me personally, the tools work just fine. Admittedly, the only tool I really use is Trench Broom, and I mod Quake 1, but that's beside the point. Another great thing about using Linux, in my opinion, is digital literacy. Over the last years, Windows and macOS have been becoming more and more like closed systems, hiding a bunch of settings from its users. Basically, they've become more and more like smartphone and tablet operating systems. Yes, haha, I know that Android is a Linux distro, not the point I'm trying to make here. I don't really know a consumer-oriented distro or desktop that does this obfuscation of settings. Even GNOME, a desktop environment focused on productivity and user-friendliness that I, as I mentioned before, find very similar to macOS, has its terminal and in-depth setting within reach at any moment. Part of this digital literacy stuff stem from parts of Linux that I haven't really mentioned yet, and which can be regarded both as one of its strengths and one of its weaknesses. The most important of which is the terminal. You see, macOS and Windows are very useful and very user-friendly in the sense that they let you do pretty much everything through user interfaces. In Linux, I've yet to encounter a distro where I never have to use the terminal. The terminal is your old-fashioned command prompt. Here you have to type what you want the computer to do. Move this file, install that program, launch this executable, compile that code. It's a very powerful tool, but sometimes it can feel a bit archaic to some people. It's very specific and it has a bit of a learning curve. It forces you to follow the logic of what's happening on the computer, at least to a certain degree, and literally put what you're doing, or what the computer is supposed to be doing, to words. Now, the frequency that you need to use the terminal has decreased majorly over the years, but sometimes you just need to dip in. How frequently that is depends on your distro and how you use your computer. For example, if you just do internet browsing and text editing, sure, you probably won't need it, especially if you have like Debian with GNOME installed. However, if you do like modding for games and sometimes need obscure software installed, yeah, you'll need to touch the terminal. However, again, I personally don't think this is a bad thing. It takes some getting used to, especially if you don't have a background in information technology or weren't chronically on your computer growing up. But it is a valuable experience that allows you for a greater understanding of what your computer does. And in this day and age, I think that's pretty important. Now, that's all fun and interesting and a good learning experience, but why did I personally switch to Linux? Now, this again is a personal take and an opinion, you can ignore it. Please don't start a fight in my YouTube comments. But to be honest, I was just really sick of Windows 11 and its constant marketing and bloatware and telemetry and introduction of new features that make it more difficult to run it locally without an account. It made my computer more slow, and it constantly kept turning on features that I didn't want, opting in for analytics that I didn't want to be a part of, and pushing me into applications that I had no interest in, like Edge and Bing Chat. I think Microsoft has pushed itself into a monopoly position in that Windows and its programs like MS Office and Teams have become this golden standard for consumers and for companies. This also gives them a monopoly on telemetry and data gathering on consumers, which I personally do not like. I also don't like being turned into a product and the feeling that I have to consent to more and more data gathering for software that I've used for ages, and being denied access to that software otherwise. Anyway, I'm getting off topic. One day I just had enough and installed Linux, and I never looked back. And ever since, every single "wanna send telemetry" button has been switched off by default instead of secretly introduced and switched on in the background. And to be honest, that's been a breath of fresh air. It hasn't always been easy, but it's always been fun. So, did I manage to convince you? If not, no worries, seriously, no hard feelings. You can interact with your computer however you like, with whatever operating systems you like. You don't need to agree with how I deal with them. But if I did convince you, awesome. Just do some Googling and get started. Pick a distro you might like, pick a display environment you might like. Try them out. If you like them, stick with them. If you don't like them, try something else. If you like them but want to try something else anyway, do so. Knock yourself out. It's all free. You can do whatever you please. Unless you're like a software engineer or something, in which case, why are you even watching this? Maybe don't start off with Arch Linux unless you're a tryhard and want to suffer. If you've downloaded something and want to make an install medium out of it onto a USB stick or something, I recommend using KDE's ISO image writer. It's really easy to use, lightweight, and it does what it says on the tin. I'll leave a link in the description. Once you've got an installation ISO on a USB, Google how you can boot from that USB and sort it out from there. Make sure to Google some guides and mostly just have fun.